If civilization ever collapsed, it would be the most advanced countries in the world that had the most to lose. In this video, I'm going to provide you with 10 reasons why the collapse of the American empire will be its own unique form of chaos, and why many of the things that made America the wealthiest, most prosperous, and powerful nation the world has ever known may also be what quickens its undoing. No one continent is a better reflection of the spectrum of human experience, as does North America. From the high point of human achievement in humanitarianism to some of mankind's darkest deeds. From the most secular forms of hedonism to the most orthodox of religious practices, whatever your heart desires you can find in America. North America is one of the most diverse nations on earth, culturally, politically, ethnically, and religiously. When it does eventually collapse, this schizophrenic socio-cultural milieu will diffuse into the chaos from which it historically emerged. On a long enough timeline, everybody who came to the Americas was an immigrant, with the exception of the First Peoples or Aboriginal peoples of North America. 99% of the people on the North American continent today cannot trace their roots here beyond 400 years. It is home to the most unique mishmash of human genetics the world has ever seen. Each and every one of us, in some shape or form, is psychologically dislocated. Thus, the reassortment of society after a grid-down, civilization-ending scenario cannot be predicted nor understood through the prism of collapsed civilizations of the past. There's a variety of different events which can lead to the breakdown of the critical infrastructure that society depends on to provide for its people. Cyber attack, economic depression, global conflict, pandemic influenza, ecological disasters, meteorological disasters, and terrorism, to name a few. These are things which can slow our increasingly fast-paced, technologically dependent society to a halt. Let's discuss the key factors which are going to make America have its own unique form of chaos should any of these events ever come to pass. Imagine if the world was a building that was on fire. Those who lived in the penthouse, should they have to jump out the windows, would have a much farther distance to fall and likely wouldn't survive the crash. Whereas those countries who had less to benefit from the current set of economic living arrangements that we have in the world have a lot less to lose and much less distance to fall. The United States, among many other Western nations on the planet, are the most hardwired technologically speaking, and increasingly more so as we enter the era of the Internet of Things, which will be facilitated by the 5G smart grid. The average person in India consumes about 1,000 kilowatts of energy every year. Compare that to the average American household, or the average Canadian household for that matter, who consumes between 13 and 15,000 kilowatts of energy every year. This increased dependency on electricity means that the average North American would have a much harder adaptation curve post-collapse. North America, like most technologically advanced regions of the globe, become more and more reliant on computers to facilitate the transactions that allow everything to flow smoothly. At the center of all this are critical infrastructure areas which are increasingly becoming more centralized. Critical infrastructure that sustains less developed countries is more decentralized. As a society and civilization evolves, the workers and inhabitants within it necessarily become more specialized in their fields, and thus the general skill sets which have allowed human beings to survive in rural environments for over 10,000 years have all but went extinct for anybody living in the city. The American workforce is highly specialized. That which empowers the American empire in the best of times makes it among the most vulnerable in the worst of times. There's an entitlement mentality that permeates the North American mindset, from the baby boomer generation onwards, reaching its peak with the current Generation Z. In the age of selfies, we've become a nation of narcissists. Millions of people have had this narcissism fueled by growing up in an era of cheap, disposable, globally traded goods ones in which people are far removed from the blood, sweat, and tears of the workers that went into those products, an age in which people no longer have to take responsibilities for the choices that they make in their lives, an age in which decision making has been offloaded to smart technology in all its various domains, an age in which a person never has to come in contact with the initial source of their own food, never having to grow it, never having to hunt it, never having to process it, an age in which it's perfectly acceptable for a 30-something to live at home with their single parent, an age in which catchphrases like first world problems have emerged as some kind of joke to make light of our own pettiness, only to act as a license for us to continue to be even more petty. We live in an age in which road rage and public freakouts over insignificant, trivial incidents yield more emotional response than most of us ever engage in with the ones that we love. For this reason, this entitlement mentality is going to lead to chaos post-collapse. The self-serving nature of a modern North American individual is going to have the consequence of doing things which are very impulsive, potentially very cowardly, when faced with a real life or death survival situation. This juvenile temperament displayed by the general population whenever they encounter the smallest amount of stress will be magnified tenfold when the lights go out. Within this sheltered bubble of an existence, people have become highly neurotic when it comes to managing the adrenal responses when put in fight-or-flight situations. SHTF will be a constant fight-or-flight situation. Many people are simply going to buckle under the pressure and snap, and this will manifest as excessive cowardice or excessive aggression, both of which will put the people around them at risk of harm. America is perhaps one of the most divided countries on the planet. Almost every election that goes by, it's nearly a 50-50 split between the right and the left. The country is as polarized in its beliefs as is mathematically possible. At the crux between this debate between right and left and individualist and collectivist is a core set of beliefs revolving around secularism versus Christianity. Christianity being the belief system espoused by over 200 million Americans. However, many of their lifestyles more emulate the secularist view. The family unit is something that emerged throughout history as a survival strategy. First came the family, then came the tribe. As nuclear families also become a thing of the past with increased divorce rates and lack of meaningful connection with extended family members, this has had the effect of further isolating people and making them more entrenched in their individualist, self-serving beliefs. Once again, this is a great point of contention in American politics. The family unit being something which has been held in high esteem by proponents of the Christian faith. This view conflicts with the insatiable polyamory of the swipe right, swipe left disposable relationship society. Now, I'm not here to say which one of these sides of the debate is right. You can make arguments in certain contexts for both. But it's clear if the grid ever went down in America, our isolated, self-serving lifestyles will not serve the task of societal reconstruction well. And the divisions between these politically and religiously charged groups will become more magnified and likely lead to civil conflict. There are 2.3 million people in American prisons. There are 1,700 state prisons, 100 federal prisons, 1,800 juvenile correctional facilities, 3,000 local jails, as well as military prisons, immigration detention centers, and numerous psychiatric hospitals. The United States has 4% of the world's population, but 22% of the world's prisoners. It's arguable that a lot of people who are serving time are not actually violent criminals. And many survivalists and preppers seem to have this fantasy that all of the criminals are going to be quote-unquote dealt with lethally in a grid-down situation by the government. But there are too many holes in this theory to be believable. What's likely to happen is that all the minimum security and lower-risk offenders would be released, and the aforementioned fatal option be one that is saved for the highest-risk offenders. So when these 2 million people bleed back out into the streets, whether they were violent criminals or not, many of them only become more steeped in the criminal mindset after doing time in jail. And to emerge into a society in a state of breakdown is a recipe for disaster. To make matters worse, there's approximately 33,000 gangs in the USA. While many of these gangs are juvenile or street-level gangs, many of them are also sophisticated criminal networks with very complex chains of command and hierarchical structures. It should be expected that the more organized crime syndicates will maintain their ranks as a survival strategy in a post-collapse environment. These gangs will have a head start over the general population, which as previously indicated will be isolated and not organized into groups large enough to defend themselves. To counteract the crime problem in the United States, which can be attributed to many different factors, there has been an increasing militarization of the police. The more corporal and reactive approach has been preferred over a more preventative community building strategy. This seems to complement the private prison industrial complex. Contrary to the best efforts of individual policemen to preserve the integrity of their forces, long gone are the days when policemen were widely respected as someone whose job it was to serve and protect, and whose presence did not elicit a fear response in the public. The arming of police forces with armored vehicles, less than lethal weaponry, and a barrage of other military-style implements, these tools would be leveraged in an attempt to pacify the starving masses. Unfortunately, the numbers may not permit a successful martial law campaign without the use of lethal force, which may be one of the final options implemented to keep the peace post-collapse. Another reason why Grid Down USA would be so raucous is because 55% of the population takes and relies on prescription medication. It could be argued that many of these medicinal dependencies are owed to people's poor lifestyle choices. There's going to be numerous health consequences as a result of people running out of their medication after a Grid Down event. In the year 2017, there were 4,468,000,000 prescriptions issued in the United States alone. To make matters worse, many of these prescriptions are for mental health medications. 1 in 6 Americans take psychiatric drugs. These psych meds are used to treat depression, psychosis, hyperactive disorder, anxiety disorder, and other mood and personality disorders. Without these medications, 1 in 6 Americans is going to be more depressed, more impulsive, more anxious, and more psychotic. There's going to be a whole lot of rash decisions being made when the pill manufacturing plants stop producing their products. To make matters worse, 23.5 million Americans struggle with addictions to illicit substances. Many of these 23 million are of the 1 in 6 Americans who take psychiatric drugs, but there are many who also do not. So it can conservatively be expected that at least half of the population of the United States is going to be without something that they've grown to be dependent upon. That in itself is going to make the situation exponentially worse than it would be in a country where people did not have the luxury of treating their ailments with synthetic medicinal substances. To make matters worse, and I am as pro-Second Amendment as they come, but there are 394 million firearms in the United States, and there's approximately 12 billion bullets purchased every year. Now take the last statistic of 50% of people not having medications, and blend that with the availability of firearms, and whether you are pro-Second Amendment or not, you can't deny that the food is likely going to run out before the bullets. Another reason why the USA is at a greater risk in a grid down scenario is one shared by any other developed country, and that is that it's over-sanitized and hyper-regulated. People's immune systems nowadays are simply propped up with the grid. Unlike places like India where people can bathe in the Ganges River and have a resistance to the many parasites that they're being exposed to, most North Americans have been living in a super sanitized whitewash bubble their entire lives. Were they to step out into the real world for a minute, they will be highly vulnerable to the increased amount of pathogens that were fostered by the unsanitary nature of a post-collapse world. On a microscopic level, our bodies are simply not ready for the viral and bacterial rigors of a collapsed civilization. Another problem is agriculture. The US and Canada produce the majority of genetically modified crops in the world, with over 90% of the cotton, corn, and soybean crops produced being some variant of genetically modified crop. reverting to a horticultural system in which food is grown and distributed locally, one that does not have the benefits of petroleum, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, fertilizers, heavy equipment, and irrigation powered by pumps that require electricity, and no longer having the GMOs to combat the now highly resistant strains of pests, weeds, and fungi, is going to make post-collapse food production a logistical nightmare. Other countries in which the populations are predominantly rural won't have this problem as much, because unlike North America, which is highly urbanized and has an agricultural system that relies solely on petroleum power, these other countries have smaller scale farms as opposed to large corporate ones. For them, SHTF would be just another day. For us, it would be mass starvation. 82% of North America is urbanized. Now that's far from the highest as far as other countries rank. But once again, these 82% of people are completely reliant on food, water, fuel, medicine, and specialized trades in order to survive in these large metropolises. It is physically impossible for the millions of urban inhabitants to sustain themselves off locally available goods and services for the short term, never mind indefinitely. The average North American meal travels 1,500 miles to get to their plate. And of course, the United States is the third most populous country on Earth, with 330 million people. That's a lot of people to manage, and there's a lot of bureaucracy which is required to manage it. The collapse of government on a regional, state, and national level will lead to dissolution and chaos. The sheer geographical size and scope of the North American continent is but yet another one of the many reasons why relying on a unified approach to mitigating any large-scale disaster is not a reliable strategy for individual survival. Our complex society requires aggressive centralization in order for it to function. Without technology and electricity, there can be no centralization. Collapse is essentially the rapid decentralization of critical infrastructure. Another major problem which may cause the collapse itself is the current credit bubble in the United States. The average personal debt in the United States is $38,000. 25% of that is credit card debt. If you factor in mortgages, the average household is in debt $137,000. If you factor in the per capita portion of the national debt, each U.S. household owes $860,000. Needless to say, most of these debts will never be paid off. Compare that with other countries which we often call poor. While wealthy nations and the individuals within them have far more assets than impoverished ones, most impoverished countries carry very little debt, such that the wealthier your country is, the greater amount of debt it has. And the United States is no exception to this rule, leading the charge with $22 trillion in debt and climbing. Eventually, the chips will be called in and the market is going to collapse. For a nation which has been conditioned to measure its self-worth on the basis of the material possessions it can garner, this will be as psychologically catastrophic as it is financially. To add fuel to this fire, the United States has one of the greatest wealth discrepancies in the world, with the top 3 billionaires having the equivalent in wealth to the bottom 50% of the population. So it's no surprise that these billionaires have alternative homes in other countries. The mentality of the West, which is best epitomized in the American mindset, is an individualist mentality. Although the individualist capitalist model has brought America great wealth and prosperity, in times of great hardship, this may defy the tribalism and collectivism required for a community to function in a grid-down environment. Individual concessions may have to be made in a world in which survival is going to depend on the size of your tribe. Currently, that's not required. Everybody can live in their one-bedroom cubicles and never be required to form meaningful relationships with their neighbors. This alienation, which is partly being propagated by social media, has also crippled our ability to communicate with one another without our digital devices. This do-it-yourself mantra of Western civilization works excellent in peacetime and in times of prosperity, but it's going to make it very hard for people to adapt to the necessary egalitarian phase of societal reconstruction. To top it all off, the US military is spread very thin, positioning itself in dozens of different countries around the world, as it's tasked itself with the leading role of trying to maintain international law and order around the planet. These are resources which are not going to be able to be employed domestically to stabilize the situation at home. These are among the main reasons why Grid Down in the USA will be its own unique form of chaos. We must not be deceived by the facade of civility that carries us from day to day in peacetime. The fact is that the average North American is highly medicated, highly socially isolated, highly individualistic, completely hardwired to the grid, whitewashed and sanitized, highly urbanized, devoid of basic survival skills, is polarized politically, is of poor relative health, and is incredibly well armed. This, my friends, is a recipe for disaster. So you better